Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs in New South Wales. Our event this evening is the last one for the year. We'll be resuming our events in February, and we hope that they'll be live once again, COVID permitting, at Glover Cottages. So tonight, our event marks the 50th anniversary of the visit of Gough Whitlam to China. At the time, Mr Whitlam was leader of the opposition in the Australian Parliament. He, of course, later became Prime Minister. His visit was controversial at the time, but established a basis for a relationship with a country which has changed gigantically in the subsequent 50 years, and a relationship which too has expanded enormously and has developed many complexities. We have two speakers tonight. Our first speaker will be Peter Phillips, a former diplomat, intelligence analyst and advisor to government with very considerable experience of China. He's going to look at the Whitlam visit in the context of its times and speak of the ways in which it has contributed to the relationship that has since developed. Peter will speak for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have another 20 minutes for questions and answers. Our second speaker, Mr Zhao Wenfei, is an experienced Chinese diplomat and Deputy Consul General at the Chinese Consulate here in Sydney. He's going to look at the current situation in our relationship and any lessons that we might be able to learn as we deal with its complexities from the Whitlam visit 50 years ago. You're welcome to address your questions to us by typing them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We have a fairly large audience tonight, and it may be that we won't get to all of your questions. Apologies in advance for that. Please don't take offence. So much for housekeeping. I'd now like to hand over to Peter Phillips.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you very much to the Australian Institute of International Affairs New South Wales branch. I commence this evening's presentation by extending my respects to the peoples, including particularly the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered, their elders, past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be listening this evening. Before I commence, I would like to acknowledge particularly Professor Stephen Fitzgerald, Australia's first ambassador to China, lifelong China scholar extraordinaire, author, academician, and guide advisor to the Whitlam 1971 mission, and more recently to the Whitlam Institute, whose recollections and thoughtful advice have informed much of my presentation this evening. As I considered my approach to this evening's presentation, I cogitated at length upon an introduction. And in the end, I could come up with nothing to match the late E.G. Whitlam's own plea that Australia should seek to understand and to keep in account not only our own, but also China's concerns at a time when the relations between our two countries are the subject of intense strains and tensions. And I quote E.G. Whitlam: "One of the great troubles between China and the West is that we expect China to believe the best about our statements of intentions, while we choose to believe the worst about hers. We expect understanding for our own fears, but we have never tried to understand hers. We have been obsessed about our own historical experience, but we scoff at China's obsession with her own experience," unquote. And so to the substance of this evening's presentation, which I commence with a brief resume of key elements of the political history and institutions of the day 50 years ago. First, in Australia, the Liberal Country Party coalition was in the 22nd year of unbroken tenure of office. In early 1971, the late William McMahon was the Prime Minister and the late Doug Anthony his deputy. But the coalition government was looking worn and stressed as Australian participation in the war in Vietnam added to public dissatisfaction and reservation. The Labor Party, out of office since 1949, was something of a remodelled and energised force under the leadership of Gough Whitlam, and had run the coalition government to a close result in the 25 October 1969 election, which had seen then Prime Minister John Gorton and his coalition partner, the then Country Party, win 66 of the then 125 House of Representatives seats to the Labor Party's 59, a majority of a mere 7 seats. In 1966, Prime Minister Harold Holt had opened an embassy in Taipei, the capital of Taiwan. Following Prime Minister Holt's tragic accidental death in the maelstrom at Cheviot Beach in Victoria in December of 1967, Mr Holt's successor, Mr McMahon, quickly and unhesitatingly embraced the coalition government's stand on recognition of the Republic of China and the government of President Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan. On 14 April 1971, Whitlam sent a cable to Zhou Enlai, and I briefly display, not a very good one, but a copy of the cable, which I have here, and I will read it. Prime Minister, Peking, China, Zhou Enlai. Australian Labor Party anxious to send delegation to the People's Republic of China to discuss the terms on which your country is interested to have diplomatic and trade relations with Australia. Stop. Would appreciate your advice whether your government would be able to receive delegation. Gough Whitlam, Leader of the Opposition, Parliament House, Canberra. This initiative was at the original suggestion of the Labor Party's then Federal Secretary, the late Mick Young, a suggestion Young made specifically in the light of strong indications at that time that China might be on the point of a decision not to renew its contract for purchases of Australian wheat. Zhou Enlai's response to the Whitlam message came 26 days later, on the 10th of May, which said they would welcome an ALP Australian delegation, quote, in mid-June or the latter part of June. Whitlam replied on 12 May, but requested early or preferably mid-July because the ALP National Conference was scheduled in the latter half of June. So a cable came confirming the invitation for the first week of July. At this point, it is, I suggest, acutely important to note the issue of timing. At Premier Zhou's direction, Whitlam's preference for mid-July was disregarded, and instead the ALP visit was directed to occur in the first week of July. History has subsequently indicated, I suggest, precisely why he did this. Students of history will recall the curiously termed ping-pong diplomacy, a phenomenon of the early 1970s when China was still mired in the great proletarian cultural revolution. China, in another clearly Zhou Enlai inspired initiative, invited an American ping pong team engaged in a tournament in Japan in April of 1971 to visit China, which they did. And on 21 April, Zhou Enlai, specifying that he was doing so on behalf of Chairman Mao Zedong, passed an invitation through the ping pong diplomacy conduit to US President Richard Nixon to visit China. On 10 May, the same date, remember, as the date on which Premier Zhou sent his invitation to Whitlam, Nixon accepted in principle, but he requested a preliminary secret meeting between Zhou and President Nixon's National Security Advisor, Dr. Henry Kissinger, to discuss and set in place the detailed arrangements for this epoch-shaping event. Why is this of such import? Well, history and the Chinese arrangements suggest very strongly that clever, shrewd Zhou Enlai saw that a visit to China at this time by a prominent leader could have an effect on the thinking of President Nixon. And so Zhou ensured that Whitlam's delegation would visit in the first week of July, as it happened from the 2nd to the 9th, and that Dr. Kissinger should arrive in Beijing on the 9th of July as the Labor Party delegation departed. The Labor delegation comprised the following: Whitlam, member for Werriwa and leader of the opposition; Tom Burns, federal president of the ALP; Mick Young, federal secretary of the ALP; Dr. Rex Patterson MP, member for Dawson and Shadow Primary Industries Minister; Mr. Graham Freudenberg, who was Prime Minister, who was leader of the opposition, Whitlam's speechwriter; and Dr. Stephen Fitzgerald, to whom I've referred at the opening of these remarks. Interestingly, the Sunday Australian newspaper, clearly at that time somewhat differently disposed towards China and the notion of a formal Australia-China relationship than is its successor or publication today, undertook to meet the fares and travel costs for Mr. Freudenberg in return for a series of 3 feature articles by Mr. Whitlam, a condition which Whitlam accepted with alacrity. The fulfilment of the Sunday Australian's condition was seen in Mr. Whitlam's feature articles on Sunday 4 July, Sunday 11 July and Sunday 18 July 1971. These feature articles, quite fascinatingly in the context of the current state of the Australia-China bilateral relationship, readily and robustly stand the test of 50 years' time and are held to this day in the resources of the Whitlam Institute at the University of Western Sydney. One enduringly interesting and intriguing element of the 1971 Whitlam ALP China mission was the composition and the role of the accompanying media party. Comprising a total of 10 correspondents, the media party included standout professionals of long experience and accumulated wisdom, and with views from across the political spectrum. Eric Walsh from the Australian Financial Review, later to become Mr. Whitlam's senior press secretary; John Stubbs from the august Fairfax stable publishers of the Sydney Morning Herald; Ken Randall from the Australian and later for 23 years, the president of the National Press Club of Australia; David Barnett from the Australian Associated Press, AAP; the late Alan Barnes from the Melbourne Age; Philip Cox from the ABC, Laurie Oakes from the Melbourne Sun. David Barnett was later to become press secretary to Whitlam's nemesis and conqueror, Malcolm Fraser, and later to write in partnership with his partner and wife, Prue Goward, a landmark biography of Australian Prime Minister John Howard. But for the purpose of this evening's exercise, it was of great importance for the Whitlam mission, and remains so for the historical record, that Barnett was a fine example of that old school journalist who, amongst his other talents, was an expert shorthand writer. And why was this of such importance to the Whitlam China mission? Well, the centrepiece of the mission, the centrepiece engagement, was on the evening of Monday, the 5th of July, when the visitors, official delegation and media party, were advised by their hosts that they should dress in suits for that evening's engagement, which was to be attendance at the screening of a film. Some film. The group was driven to the Tiananmen Square, where they were ushered into the Great Hall of the People and into the presence of Premier Zhou Wenfei for that epoch-making meeting between Whitlam and the Chinese Premier. Those familiar with this genre of exercise will recognise the format: exchanges of pleasantries, handshakes and smiles for the cameras and for the media, who are then ushered from the room to lead the principals to get stuck into the substantive dialogue and exchanges. Except that, on this occasion, no ushering out of the amazed and incredulous media men, who remained for the whole of the 2 hours plus worth of history in the making, which is where David Barnett came into his own. For Barnett, the razor reliable and punctilious shorthand writer, took a verbatim record of the Whitlam-Zhou exchange, which, to his eternal credit, he later shared with all of his media colleagues, ensuring comprehensively accurate reporting of that most important occasion. The net result of all this was not only a story of unimaginable magnitude at the time, but also an enduring and indelible example of the better angels and the robust skills which characterised the Australian National Media Corps as it was on that July day in 1971, at its best. So unlike much of what today masquerades as informed and serious reporting and analysis by, regrettably, amateurs. But back to the actual chronology, which makes for interesting reading and reflection. On the 2nd of July, Whitlam enters China from Hong Kong via Guangzhou. On the 3rd of July at midnight, Whitlam arrives in Beijing after a 5-hour nightmare flight from Guangzhou through a long-lasting lightning and thunderstorm. On the 4th of July, Whitlam meets Chinese ministers for trade and for foreign affairs Ji Pengfei and Bai Xiangguo. And on the 5th of July, Whitlam meets Zhou Enlai. On the 9th of July, Whitlam's 55th birthday, he leaves for Shanghai, and a birthday celebration and a cake from Premier Zhou Enlai. And on the 9th of July, Dr. Henry Kissinger arrives in Beijing from Pakistan to commence discussions with Zhou Enlai on the writing of a new chapter in world history. On the 11th of July, Kissinger departs for the USA, and on the 15th of July, Nixon's worldwide television broadcast announcing he would visit China as the President of the United States before May 1972. At this point in the recollection in the narrative, interest grows quite sharply. In a speech to the Melbourne Young Liberals on the 10th of July, interestingly, at the very same time that Kissinger and Premier Zhou Enlai were meeting in Beijing to discuss and finalise the foundations upon which the new China-USA relationship would be based, Prime Minister McMahon said, and I quote, "It is time to expose the shams and absurdities of this excursion into instant coffee diplomacy. We must not become pawns of the giant communist power in our region. I find it incredible that at a time when Australian soldiers are still engaged in Vietnam, the leader of the Labor Party is becoming a spokesman for those against whom we are fighting. By accepting Peking as the sole capital of China, he is abandoning Taiwan. In no time at all, Mr. Zhou had Mr. Whitlam on a hook, and he played him as a fisherman plays a trout." Immortal words. And the following day, Prime Minister McMahon doubled down by asserting, and again I quote, "China has been a political asset to the Liberal Party and will continue to be an asset for some time." How gloomy it is then to be presented again some 50 years and 5 months later with unchanged fare, as we are so frequently in today's media. The tale which I told about the mission itself led to a period of sometimes turbulent rule by a Whitlam-headed government, which returned to Asia, ended our involvement in the terrible wastage of the Vietnam War, recognised the People's Republic of China, and opened Australia's embassy in Beijing in 1973. Whitlam was succeeded by another towering presence in the form of Malcolm Fraser in 1975. Malcolm Fraser got it in relation to Australia's dealings with and presence in Asia, and especially in China. Not long after taking office and affirming his legitimacy of tenure in a smashing electoral victory over a shattered and demoralised Labor Party in 1975, Fraser led an official Australian government mission to China early in 1976. Australia's engagement with Asia, Fraser was signalling, is not going away. Indeed, it's not going to diminish, and nor did it. Fraser was succeeded in 1983 by Prime Minister Bob Hawke, and Hawke in 1971 by Prime Minister Paul Keating, both of whom set their personal and political and Australia's economic developmental seals on Australia's continuing development of a wide-ranging and interdependent relationship with China over the years from 1983 to 1996. And when John Howard succeeded Keating in 1996, he quickly rebutted the colourfully dismissive Keating observation that, quote, Asia is what coalition leaders fly over on their way to England, unquote, and reaffirmed Australia's acknowledgement of the vital and ongoing importance of Asia to Australia's future. And as Prime Minister, Howard backed this acknowledgement with multiple official visits to and exchanges with key Asian region countries, including especially China. And then, by then thoroughly gloomy supporters of the Labor Party, came for them the wondrous miracle of Kevin 07. My name is Kevin, I come from Brisbane, and I'm here to help you. So what went wrong? Australia-China relations reached a high watermark when on Friday, 24 October 2003, then Chinese President and General Secretary of the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of China, Hu Jintao, stood and formally addressed a joint sitting of the House of Representatives and the Senate of the Parliament of Australia, just 2 days, by the way, after US President George W. Bush had performed an identical ritual before an identical audience in exactly the same forum, that is on Wednesday, the 22nd of October. And we sustained and matched this high watermark right through to June 2010, when then Chinese Vice President Xi Jinping was the honoured guest in major ceremonies in the Australian Parliament. And so I can but repeat what went wrong, what has reduced us and our relationship with China to the sorry and tattered state in which we find it today. Is it that China has grown? Or is it that China has changed? Or is it that China has always been as it is now, but has taken us until now to recognise this? Or are there shortcomings which have somehow crept into our capacity to recognise the importance, indeed the imperative, of a steady, stable, workable engagement with China? Whatever, I suggest these and related considerations must continue to be focal preoccupations of the Institute and, of course, more broadly, of government in Australia. And I welcome any opportunity which might arise this evening to tease out further these matters during the Q&A session. And I look forward also to further cooperation with the Consul General of China and with Deputy Consul General Mr Zhao Wenfei, as well as with the Institute. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure, everybody, to welcome Deputy Chinese Consul General and experienced Chinese diplomat, Mr Zhao Wenfei.
Thank you, Mr. Lincoln, for your kind introduction and for the invitation from the Australian Institute of International Affairs in New South Wales. And of course, Peter is just offline, but thank you, Peter, for your comprehensive and insightful remarks. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Chinese Consulate General in Sydney, it's my great pleasure to participate in this event marking the 50th anniversary of Mr. Whitlam's visit to China. Against the background of the current difficulties in China-Australian relations, I believe that today's event has reflected our wishes for the improvement of our bilateral relations, and it is timely and important. As Mr. Lincoln said in his opening remarks, the visit 50 years ago paved the way for the establishment of diplomatic relations between our two countries. Since then, friendly exchanges and practical cooperation have been expanding between our two countries. And this has delivered huge benefits to the two peoples and also contributed to the peace and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region. Looking back, I would like to pay tribute to the elder generation of Chinese and Australian leaders for their political wisdom and strategic courage. I also express sincere gratitude to all those who participated in this part of history. Ladies and gentlemen, as the Chinese saying goes, knowing history helps understand what is happening today. So what is the legacy and inspiration of Mr. Whitlam's visit to China? I have in mind 5 keywords to summarize the experiences and lessons of this visit, which are foresight, trust, respect, reciprocity, and exchange. So my first keyword is foresight. 50 years ago, the Cold War between East and West was in full swing. To many Australians, China was a mysterious place behind the bamboo curtain. Mr. Whitlam had been widely criticized for his decision to visit China. However, as Peter just said, just 5 days after Mr. Whitlam left China, news broke that Dr. Henry Kissinger was in China and President Richard Nixon was going to China. That was actually a very good birthday gift to Mr. Whitlam because that was exactly his 55th birthday. And at that time, Mr. Whitlam believed that Australia must accept, I quote, accept China as a permanent and significant part of the international landscape, unquote. This demonstrated his profound understanding of the international situation and of China's great potential. 50 years later, the world is undergoing once in a century profound changes. Asia is rising and China continues to develop. According to estimates, Asia's GDP accounted for 40% of the world's total in 2020 and is expected to exceed 50% in the next 10 years. As for China, 2021 this year marks the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China, and we have started a new journey of fully building a modern socialist country. China's sustained development will open up broader space for cooperation between countries around the world, including Australia and China. History tells us that if we approach our relations from a broad strategic perspective and bear in mind the fundamental interests of our peoples, China-Australia relations and the development of our two countries will continue to benefit. So we do hope that the Australian side will show the same political wisdom and strategic courage as Mr. Whitlam did half a century ago. That is to say, look at the big picture, follow the historic trend, and promote the healthy and stable development of China-Australia relations. Of course, the Chinese side is ready to make joint efforts for that. Now, my second keyword is trust. In April 1973, Prime Minister Whitlam told Australia's first ambassador to China, Stephen Fitzgerald, that Australia would develop a relationship with China based on, I quote, friendship, cooperation, and mutual trust, unquote. So over the past 50 years, the friendship and cooperation between China and Australia have deepened. However, I strongly believe that for the sake of the long-term development of the bilateral relations, we must give high attention to the missing link of mutual trust. Some people in Australia hold a negative view on China, and they even claim that China is Australia's #1 threat. Because of suspicion and prejudice, any policy made by China may be maliciously interpreted, and any bilateral exchanges and cooperation may be viewed as interference in Australia's domestic affairs. I think that that's the root cause for the current difficulties in China-Australia relations. However, those accusations are totally inconsistent with the facts and the truth. China does not have any hidden strategic ambition. We only have the development strategy with the purpose of giving the Chinese people a better life. And development is always our top priority. China has never sought to change Australia's political system, and we have no intention of exporting values or lifestyles. China has never interfered in Australia's internal affairs or its legislative process. However, what we oppose is simply any legislation intentionally targeting China or discriminating against the Chinese institutions and individuals. As the former Prime Minister Paul Keating said, China is not the old Soviet Union, and it is not attacking or forcibly incorporating other countries into a grand union or exporting a universal ideology. It is hoped that the Australian side will take a rational view of China's strategic intention and regard China as an opportunity and a partner rather than as a threat or opponent. I believe that this is the basic prerequisite for dialogue and cooperation between our two countries. Now, the third keyword is respect. 50 years ago, the differences between China and Australia may have been greater than they are today, but they did not stop Mr. Whitlam from traveling to China. For the following decades, differences between the two sides have not prevented us from developing a dynamic and vigorous relationship. History shows that when we treated each other as equals, showed common ground despite differences, and respected each other's core interests and major concerns, China-Australian relations would develop smoothly and move forward. Otherwise, our relationship would suffer difficulties and setbacks. Most importantly, we must respect each other's sovereignty, security, and development interests. Recently, some people in Australia have been hyping up issues concerning Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang under the pretext of democracy and human rights. However, these issues are purely China's internal affairs, and other countries should not interfere. China suffered deep humiliation from the loss of sovereignty in modern times. And on issues concerning our sovereignty and territorial integrity, there is no room for compromise and concessions. China and Australia have different historic and cultural backgrounds, and we are at different stages of development. So it is impossible for us to agree on everything, but it is important that we respect each other as equals and reduce misunderstandings through dialogue. China is ready to learn from other countries, and we welcome any suggestions or criticisms as long as they are objective, well-intentioned, and constructive. In fact, just as what I'm doing today, communication and listening are very important tasks for Chinese diplomats in Australia. However, we will never accept groundless slanders and disinformation. We strongly oppose any smears and accusations based on arrogance and bias. I believe that the solution of differences cannot be found in megaphone diplomacy. Instead, we should engage in constructive discussions on the basis of equality. This is how mutual respect between countries should like. So the fourth keyword is reciprocity. At the time of Mr. Whitlam's visit to China, our bilateral trade volume was less than $100 million. 50 years later, China accounts for about 1/3 of Australia's exports, and Chinese investment in Australia has exceeded $40 billion. China's imports and investment have created thousands of jobs in Australia and helped numerous families to increase incomes. And the other way round, Australia's iron ore, coal, and LNG have contributed to China's economic miracle. Regrettably, in the past few years, restrictions and obstacles have been imposed in our bilateral cooperation. For example, Chinese business investment in Australia have been subject to discriminatory restrictions. Last year, China's foreign direct investment in total to the world increased by 12%, but Chinese business investment in Australia went down about 60%. And China's high-tech companies were unjustifiably suppressed, even when they were willing to take measures to avoid the so-called national security risks. And cooperation in education have been under unreasonable scrutiny. Some people even claim that the Chinese students are spies, and Confucius institutes are engaging in cultural infiltration activities. It is my belief that pragmatic cooperation is the foundation and driving force for China-Australia political relations. In turn, the political relations provide an important guarantee for that pragmatic cooperation. China and Australia are highly complementary in terms of resource endowment and industrial structure that makes us natural partners for mutually beneficial cooperation. Therefore, it is our hope that the Australian side will provide a favorable political environment for China-Australia practical cooperation, and I believe that serves the interests of both sides. Now, the fifth keyword is exchange, people-to-people exchange. 50 years ago, China and Australia found each other mysterious. Today, we are no longer strangers. That's because we visit each other more often. In 1971, there were no Chinese students in Australia and fewer than 500 two-way visitors. But today, about 220,000 Chinese study in Australia, and before the outbreak of COVID-19, more than 1.4 million Chinese tourists travel to Australia every year. And Australian study centers operate in 35 universities across China, and thousands of Chinese students study Australia as part of their courses. Also, Mandarin has become the second largest language in Australia, only after English. And the Chinese Consulate General is based in New South Wales. I'd like to let you know that in April this year, a ceremony was held by Her Excellency Margaret Beasley, Governor of New South Wales, and the Chinese Consul General Zhou Niming at the Government House. And they planted a jingle tree that symbolized the sister state relationship between China's Guangdong province and New South Wales. It is our belief that lasting relationship is built on heart-to-heart exchanges. Let us hope that people-to-people exchanges between China and Australia will continue to expand and friendship continue to deepen. This will provide a solid social foundation for the long-term development of our bilateral relations. Ladies and gentlemen, next year, 2022, marks the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between China and Australia. 50 years ago, our two countries worked together for economic development and people's well-being, and also for the sake of peace and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region. Today, 50 years later, for the same reason, we can and should make the same choice, standing once again on the right side of history. A better relationship is the shared expectation of our two peoples. It is my hope that the Australian people, including all of you present here tonight, will view China's development and China-Australia relations in an objective and rational manner and play a positive role in the sound and healthy development of our bilateral relations. That concludes my remarks. Thank you, Mr. Lincoln, and thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zhou. I don't think you were still on the air when I wondered aloud whether it might be timely for Australia and China to have some dialogue about China joining the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And perhaps Mr. Zhou, as well as you, would like to comment on that.
Well, I'll comment first, if I may, Ian. I think that that would be a highly desirable step, and I further think that it offers an opportunity for the Australian government, regardless of which side of politics in Australia prevails in the forthcoming federal election in the early part of next year, to indeed take the initiative of inviting China to become, to join the CPTPP, thereby making a clear statement of a clear recognition of the advantage to world trade which would be secured by China's involvement.
Thank you. Mr. Zhao.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Lincoln. As to the TPP or CPTPP question, I think that the Chinese side has, because in the past 40 years or so, since China's opening up, China's development has benefited from globalization and from the world. So it's our position that the Chinese side always support any initiative or arrangement that contributes to regional integration and free trade. And as you know, that the Chinese side has already applied to join the CPTPP, and we are ready to talk to various parties, including the Australian side, in this regard. Thank you, Mr. Lincoln.
That's very good news. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to our question coordinator to feed in questions that we've received from our Zoom audience. Tom.
Thank you, Ian. And I would like to encourage everyone that they can submit their questions to both speakers via the Q&A function at the bottom of their Zoom facility. I would like to first direct a question to Peter Phillips. Peter, you spoke about the better angels and robust skills of the Australian Media Corps on that visit. Could you speak to what the current state of reporting on the China-Australian relationship is like?
Tom, thank you for that question, and thank you to the questioner. I regret to say that my view at the present time is that Australian coverage of, analysis of, reporting on, commentary on China is predominantly negative and in many instances not particularly well informed. I made the remarks which I made particularly about the press corps, which the press corps members and the press corps delegation which accompanied the Whitlam mission, because their excellence of reporting, their professionalism, their objectivity proved itself in their reporting, both while they were in China and then after they returned from China. The standard of today's reporting is rather patchier than was the case then, and I regret that some of it is driven by regrettable speculation and disinformation, and it makes for an unfortunate hodgepodge sometimes of reporting on and commentary on what for Australia remains, all the tensions notwithstanding, one of our most important bilateral relationships, that is the relationship with China.
Thank you. Deputy Consul General, we have a question here from Andrea Connor. Is the role of the Whitlam government well known in China amongst the Chinese people? How is he viewed as an individual?
I mean, how is he viewed in China?
Yes, yeah. What is his opinion of you?
Yes, I think that because of his trip to China 50 years ago, and he made a great contribution to the establishment of diplomatic relations between our two countries. So I think that many Chinese people know about Mr. Whitlam, and also they speak highly of Mr. Whitlam's contribution. And because We all know that in the past few years, China-Australia relations have experienced continuing grave difficulties. So many people, especially are looking back in July this year, because both sides celebrated the 50th anniversary of this visit, and also a lot of commemorative articles was published in Chinese media. So many people getting to know more about Mr. Whitlam, about his trip to China 50 years ago. And I think that the Chinese people do think that today we still need the political wisdom and the strategic courage that Mr. Whitlam displayed 50 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Jocelyn to you, Peter. Can you please comment on the concerns about the strategic objectives of the Soviet Union that underlay Whitlam and Fraser's desire to strengthen relations with China?
Yes, thank you, Tom. The matter was referred to during the Whitlam-Zhou exchange, and as I mentioned in my remarks, is interestingly recorded in David Barnett's excellent shorthand verbatim record of the discussions between Whitlam and Zhou. Even at that time, there was more than considerable reservation in China about the relationship which existed with Russia. Zhou was quite dismissive of much of Russia's perceived intent at that time, and he and Whitlam entered into a quite lengthy discussion of the framework of bilateral relations with which China was surrounded, including Russia and Japan, Southeast Asia. They went to the Vietnam, and of course, the overlooming relationship with the United States of America. But there was clear meeting of minds between Whitlam and Zhou on most of the matters of foreign relations, both China's relations with the rest of the world and Australia's foreign policy and foreign relations at the time. Whitlam was an absolute fanatic of intensive study and intensive consumption of reporting and of analysis on these key issues before his visit to China. Stephen Fitzgerald told me in lead-up discussions which I had with him that he found Whitlam to be enormously well-informed, particularly on the goals which China had expressed and had indicated in the period leading up to the visit.
Thank you. Deputy Consul General, we have an anonymous question here which goes to the heart of what the current state of Australia-China diplomatic relations and what actions are required from both China and Australia to re-establish high-level diplomatic contact.
Thank you. So on current bilateral relations, I'd like to say that as I just said in my remarks, starting from the second half of 2017, China-Australia relations have experienced great difficulties. And that's not what the Chinese side would wish to see, and also the responsibility rests with the Australian side. I think that the crux of the setbacks and the difficulties is that the Australian side has over again and again undermined China's core interests on such issues as Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, And also, the Australian side has imposed unwarranted restrictions and obstacles on normal exchanges and cooperation. And so, of course, it's always our belief that the healthy and stable development of China-Australian relations serves the fundamental interests of both countries and both peoples. And we are always ready to make efforts for that. But it's always joint efforts to develop the bilateral relations. And we hope that the Australian side will meet China halfway and do more that are conducive to mutual trust and mutually beneficial cooperation between the two sides, so as to provide the necessary conditions for the healthy and stable development of the bilateral relations. And as I said in my remarks, mutual trust is the prerequisite for bilateral cooperation. And so I think that it's a fundamental question for the Australian side to answer whether China is viewed as a threat or as an opportunity and a partner. Because only after Australia view China as an opportunity can we have the foundation and the basis for cooperation and dialogue. Otherwise, there will be no precondition, no condition for bilateral cooperation. And you also mentioned the high-level dialogue. And the Chinese side always attach importance to high-level dialogue between our two sides. And I noticed that the Australian side has from time to time claimed that Australia is always ready to talk to China, but but the Chinese side is not interested. But I would like to point out that I agree on the importance of a high-level dialogue. But actually, we have been kept talking to each other at different levels between our officials, and the communication channels, both in Beijing and Canberra, is smooth. But at the same time, I'd like to point out make 2 points. The first one is that we should not hold a dialogue just for the sake of a dialogue. And from dialogue, we always expect substance and not just empty talks. And to prepare for, especially for high-level talks and dialogues, we need to reach consensus on the future direction of our bilateral relations. And we need to find real solutions to the problems in our relations. So that's my first point. And the second point is that for China-Australia to have a high-level dialogue, we do need favorable atmosphere and environment. So actually, I'm talking about when we see senior officials in this country keep on saying that China is a threat to Australia, and even suggesting that Australia may get involved in a military conflict in certain parts of China, I believe that this is not a conducive environment for the two sides to engage in high-level dialogues. So personally, I hope that the Australian side will do more that is conducive to mutual trust and bilateral cooperation, so that we can have more constructive and friendly dialogues. Thank you.
Tom and Ian, I wonder if you would mind, and Deputy Consul General Zhao, I hope you won't mind if I add just some further, very brief thoughts to that answer. First, it's very pleasing to note that the Chinese government has now notified the Australian government of and received agreement from the Australian government concerning the appointment of Mr Xiao Qian as the new Chinese ambassador. He's not yet in country. He will be very soon. Ambassador to be, or ambassador designate Xiao, comes from a very senior position as the head of the Asian Affairs Department in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to which he came from his immediate past head of mission appointment as China's ambassador to Indonesia. His background of experience as a serving Chinese diplomat also includes postings in the United States and in India, as well as elsewhere around the Asian region. 57 years old, very experienced. I must say that I regard this as being a positive step by the Chinese government, and I look forward to making the acquaintance of Ambassador Xiao Qian and to his assumption of office in the not too far distant future. Meanwhile, may I add one final, very brief remark. In recent times, I've seen it to be a very positive step by the Chinese government, by the Chinese embassy in particular in Canberra, to have made available senior spokespersons on a couple of occasions, most specifically in recent times, in the form of now Chargé d'Affaires, Embassy Minister Mr Wang Xining, who has recently contributed feature articles to the Australian Financial Review and to Guardian newspapers. I consider this commentary and this engagement by China and this enter into this form of exchange of insight and commentary to be a positive development, and I would encourage this to be something which the Chinese embassy and Chinese official representatives in Australia continue.
Thanks, Peter. Tom, I think we've got time for one or two more questions.
Yep, absolutely. We can take one question from Christopher Skinner, which is for Peter Phillips. And that's if you could talk to the influence and impact of President Xi Jinping on China-Australia relations since 2010.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Chris. Can I first just note, and I should have perhaps done so a little earlier, 2022 is going to be a year of significant importance in China. We'll see the National People's Congress in March, April. The National People's Congress will give us endorsement of decisions reached and made by the 6th plenum of the Communist Party of China Central Committee earlier this month, relating to the role of President Xi Jinping in the leadership, and confirming that President Xi is likely to break with what has been the tradition, not a constitutional requirement, but the tradition that the most senior members of the Chinese leadership serve 2 5-year terms. I think we will see at the end of 2022, at the 20th Party Congress, at the end of the year, probably in November, a confirmation that President Xi will serve at least a 3rd term. This is a very, very important step for China, and one which we should look forward to. Now, Tom, just take me back briefly to the question again, because I've talked myself away from it.
It goes to the influence on the bilateral relationship since 2010. Yes,
you know, Xi Jinping, I did in my remarks mention his visit here as vice president in 2010. Indeed, I hope many of our listeners this evening will share my recollection of that occasion, because Xi Jinping was a key speaker in a major function in the Great Hall in Parliament House in Canberra, a function which he left to go and have a meeting with then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, which was in fact the last meeting which Mr Rudd had in his role as Prime Minister, because later on that same day, members of the Labor Party moved against Mr Rudd's leadership, and by the time Xi Jinping, who departed Canberra later that evening, by the time he had reached Darwin, to his very great surprise, he learned that Mr Rudd, with whom he had had discussions in Mr Rudd's role as Prime Minister of Australia, was no longer the occupant of that position. But President Xi, on his return to China, mentioned with great satisfaction that he had in fact now visited all of Australia's states, and that he particularly looked forward to a further deepening and a further broadening of the ties and the links which exist between Australia and China. I see no evidence that President Xi's attitude towards the Australia-China relationship at its base has changed, although I'm sure that he, along with people on both sides, would hope for improvement in the atmosphere and the quality of the relationship during the next year.
I think we've got time for perhaps one last question.
Perfect. I might take the opportunity to ask my own question as the last one to Deputy Consul General. I wanted to pick up on how you'd spoken about Australia and China have different historical and cultural backgrounds, and it's impossible to agree on everything. My question is, where can Australia and China find common ground, and on what can we both agree?
Thank you, Mr. Dixon. Yes, China and Australia are very different, and but from the visit of Mr. Whitlam to China, we can see that we can always seek common ground while sharing differences. So I think that we are living in COVID-19 world, and the global economic recovery is still yet to gain momentum. And I think that both China and Australia are important economies in the world. So in this post-pandemic era, our two countries have a lot of common interests, and we have a bigger space to cooperate in promoting the global economic recovery, and also because this world is faced with many global challenges, and on issues of like climate change, energy security, and anti-terrorism, I think that and cybersecurity, in China and Australia, we can always cooperate. That's for the benefit of our two peoples, and also for the benefit of the whole world. Thank you, Mr. Dixon. And can I also respond to what Mr. Peter Phillips said earlier about that the Chinese embassy and the Consulate General in Australia have been reaching out to the local media and academics. And I'd like to add that because it's the responsibility of the Chinese embassy and the Consulate General, the responsibility for us to promote mutual understanding, friendly exchanges, and mutual mutually beneficial cooperation between our two countries. And especially, I agree with what Peter said, that the Australian media has played a negative role in the development of China-Australia relations in the past few years. And actually, I think that there seems to be a pre-existing narrative framework in Australian media's coverage of China. When those Australian media report about China, it's always negative. I will give you an example, which is we take the COVID-19 epidemic prevention and control measures as example. When China, because China has taken a proactive strategy in fighting against this epidemic. So when China takes strict prevention and control measures, the Australian media have been saying about the so-called violation of human rights or freedom. But when the same measures are adopted in Australia, in the states and the territories, the Australian media will report as strict but necessary measures. So I think that what we, in this time of difficulties in China-Australian relations, what we need to do is more engagement and more communications. And it's the responsibility for us at the Consulate General and at the Chinese Embassy to present a real China, a true China to the Australian academia, to the Australian media, and to the Australian public. Actually, before COVID-19, there were about 500,000 Australian people traveling to China every year. And if you ask those people who have been to China, I think most of them will tell you a different story about China because they have seen China with their own eyes. They have experienced what happened in China, and they would give a more objective observation of China's development and of China-Australia relations. So unfortunately, in the past few years, we have found that what the Australian media's coverage of China is somewhat against the fact. It's sometimes totally different from what is happening in China. So it's my hope that the Australian Institute of International Affairs and also friends like Peter Phillips will continue to this kind of engagement and communications so that we can, you can also help more Australian people to know more about real China. And I think that knowing each other is the basis of mutual understanding and mutual trust, and which is very important for the development of China-Australia relations. Thank you.
Thank you. Warmest thanks to both you, Mr. Zhao, and to you, Peter Phillips, for a really thoughtful and stimulating discussion tonight. And thanks to our audience for the interest you've shown by joining us and for some very good questions which have provoked an interesting discussion. It's time to say goodbye for the year, and I'd like to express thanks not only for your support tonight, but throughout this rather difficult year at the Institute. It's been great to have your support and your company, even if it's only electronic, for our events. But for now, it remains only to wish you all the best for the festive season and to say good night.